This is a special edition of I24 News. I'm Nicole Zedek, live in Tel Aviv. History has been made today in the Middle East as the decades-long rule of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is over. It took rebel forces less than 2 weeks to topple his regime after launching a surprise offensive the same day that a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon went into effect. Iran and its proxies are weak. Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine, and Islamist rebels took this key moment in time to topple the Assad regime. Our Lynn Plagmeyer breaks down the rapid timeline of events that led to this major development.
On November 27th of this year, the Syrian rebels launched a surprise attack on the Syrian army in the northern province of Aleppo. A day later, the opposition cuts the highway linking Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, to the capital Damascus. The rebels shell Aleppo and enter the city. Russian warplanes attack Aleppo for the first time since 2016. Despite Russian efforts, the opposition seizes control of most of Aleppo and of more than 80 towns and villages in the north.
We will oppose this in every possible way. We will support the legitimate Syrian authorities, and at the same time, of course, we will actively promote the need to resume dialogue with the opposition.
On December 1st, Aleppo falls into the hands of the Syrian rebels for the first time in more than a decade. The Iranian foreign minister travels to Damascus and reiterates his support for Assad's regime.
Thanks to God, and after 8 years of being displaced from it by the doing of Assad family and his criminal machine. Today we return to Aleppo by the will of God. We return to our country. I am the son of Aleppo and was displaced from it 8 years ago in 2016.
The opposition captures the strategical city of Hama, Syria's fourth largest city, after days of fierce fighting with Assad's forces. 2 days later, the opposition takes Homs, known as the capital of the revolution.
This historic event that will distinguish between truth and falsehood. We urge our brothers in jihad to show kindness to the people, grant safety to those who have abandoned their weapons, and not pursue those who have fled.
On December 8th, Assad reportedly flees the country while the regime's army pulls out of Damascus. The opposition enters Damascus and declares an end to Assad's decades-long family rule, sending thousands into the streets in celebration.
Allah Akbar. The regime has been overthrown, along with the state security branch and Air Force intelligence. Praise be to God. We have triumphed over the tyrant Bashar and his allies, as well as the Iranians and Russians. Our brothers in Hama, we are waiting for you, and brothers in Homs as well. God, Syria, freedom.
Now that Assad's regime has been overthrown, an unsure future lies ahead for the war-torn country and the whole of the Middle East.
Today, December 8th, 2024, is a historic day. But what does this mean for the region, for Syrians and the rebels who now took over the capital? Well, to talk about these breaking developments, I'm joined by a former senior advisor to the U.S. State Department, Hazem Al-Gabra, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hazem, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right now, the main question is exactly how this was able to happen so quickly. It was clearly a surprise offensive, but still, when these rebels arrived at the capital in Damascus, they were met with basically no force from the Syrian army. And so this was a rapid development, a rapid timeline, but still a shock indeed.
Absolutely. Let's go back in history a little bit. 2011, 2012, the beginning of the Syrian civil war. The rebels took over mass areas in Syria, mostly unopposed, actually, when you think about it. There were some resistance by the regime, but not that much. The regime was then propped by Iran and Russia. Russia eventually became preoccupied with Ukraine. Iran is defeated right now, at least Hezbollah is defeated, and there are other militias that were supporting the Syrian regime. And the Syrian regime found itself alone with a weakened army, with a non-existent army, actually, the army that has not modernized in decades. And this is what happens. And if you want, there is no better symbol to how the Syrian regime ended than this lonely tank sitting in the middle of Damascus in Umayyad Square, becoming a photo booth for people to come and take selfies with.
There's certainly the images that are coming out right now are shocking indeed, to say the least. I want to talk about this rebel group that led this takeover. We're talking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the HTS. And this group is truly the remnants of al-Qaeda, although they are trying to distance themselves from al-Qaeda. But do the Syrian people want this? We are seeing these massive celebrations taking to the streets, but are there any Syrians who are perhaps sad about the downfall of Assad?
There must be a few that were benefiting from Assad directly. They were on payroll, they were involved in the drug trade, they were involved in illicit activities, or oppressing the Syrian people and benefiting from that. And the general corruption that was really the headline of the Syrian regime over decades. That said, the Syrian people were ready for anybody else, pretty much, following the Assad regime rule. That doesn't mean the next ruling force will be ideal. We are definitely, at least in the US, we're in a wait-and-see mode, trying to see how these rebel groups are going to interact with each other, with the Syrian people, and with Syria's neighbors, and with the international community. There's a lot for them to prove here, and it's not going to be easy. But we are not going to prejudge anybody. Even, and again, it's not easy for us to say this in the U.S., but we know that the Ahmad Shara, who used to be called Jolani, used to fight the U.S. forces in Iraq, and he was ISIS Baghdadi's envoy to Syria. However, we did not choose this. This is now the status quo on the ground and the situation on the ground, and we're trying to see how to deal with it by understanding it better.
And to see exactly how it does play out. We're going to get back to exactly how this might play out and what we might expect next. Hazam, stay with us, but I want to bring into this discussion as well our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran, in studio with me right now. Ariel, as we're talking about the reaction from the Syrian public, we've been seeing these videos posted all over of these really massive cheers, joyous taking to the streets inside the capital of Damascus. And so what are we hearing from the reaction from the Syrian public following this historic move?
It's unfathomable for them. They wanted to see the Assad regime fall at any cost, no matter who replaced him, whether it be Americans or Turks or Islamist rebels. They wanted to see Assad gone. The dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad is hard to describe for those who aren't in Syria, but it was characterized by brute force and mass arrests. One of the main striking images that we're seeing are the rebels going prison by prison, releasing tens of thousands of political prisoners. Now, these include women, and even children were seen in these videos. Kids, toddlers who are no older than 4 years old, and it's not clear if they were even born in prison, living there their whole lives. Syrians who I've been speaking to in Syria, they're afraid to speak to Israeli media, but I've also been in contact with Syrian expats who say they haven't slept in days following the excitement and the rapid pace of events evolving, saying that they're seeing an entirely new Syria, a Syria unlike any other in the world. They're optimistic and confident that a new Syria, a land of peace, will be built. This is obviously still premature because the rebel forces are still establishing their control over the major cities, over the capital. There's even a curfew in place right now in the capital until tomorrow morning to prevent any violence or any chaos from erupting. And I do have to say, yes, we're talking about Islamist rebels, descendants of al-Qaeda who have branched away. They're not ISIS. They've been fighting ISIS, but they've treated all the areas that they've released, all the different populations that they've liberated with respect, with calm, no violence. And this is something that I'm sure many in the West and obviously in Syria would like to see continue.
but these coming days and weeks are going to be a true test to what kind of Syria we are going to see on the other side of this revolution, as they're calling it.
Well, you talk about this contrast, perhaps, that we're seeing right now versus the Assad regime. I want us to take a look back at that, because with the collapse of Assad's 2-decade reign and half a century of the Assad family regime, I want us to take a look back at the 54-year rule we're talking about and its brutality against government dissenters. Rima Siegel reports.
The Assad family regime, marked by its brutal rule over Syria, has collapsed after 54 years. The Assad regime began in 1970 when Hafez al-Assad, then defense minister, orchestrated a military coup and seized presidential power. A Soviet ally who ruled Syria for 3 decades, he commanded with an iron fist. Oppression was widespread and dissent was met with extreme violence. In 1982, the president and his army slaughtered thousands of opponents, ending an uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood in what is now known as the Hama massacre. Lasting for weeks, the siege is one of the bloodiest chapters in Syria's modern history, where between 10 to 40,000 people were killed. After a long illness, Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, paving the way for his son, Bashar al-Assad, to take over. In just a few hours, the Syrian parliament changed the constitution to lower the presidential age of eligibility from 40 to Assad's age at the time of 34. As a Western-educated doctor, he was seen as a youthful leader who might bring in a more progressive, moderate regime from that of his fathers. But this was far from the case. After the Arab Spring's pro-democracy movement swept through the region, Assad met protesters with brutal force. What began as peaceful protests calling for political reform quickly turned violent as the Assad regime cracked down, leading to widespread repression and escalating into the Syrian civil war. Syria became a battleground for regional and international powers. Assad's government garnered support from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, while the opposition received varying support from Western countries, Turkey, and Gulf states. 2 years after the start of the war, on August 21, 2013, a sarin gas attack in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta killed hundreds, including women and children, leading to global outrage and calls for military intervention. While Russia brokered an agreement to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, Syria has been accused of chemical attacks up until 2018. In 2015, Russia launched airstrikes in Syria, turning the tide of the war in Assad's favor. This marked a pivotal turn in helping the regime regain control of key areas, including Aleppo.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank you and the state of Russia and the Russian officials, and of course the Russian people, for their support of the Syrian people.
Despite accusations of war crimes, the Assad regime held on, propped up by Russian and Iranian support. But Syria remained deeply fractured, with millions displaced and much of the country's infrastructure destroyed. In December 2024, Syrian rebels quickly swept through government-held areas and toppled Assad's regime in just 12 days. Russia and Iran offered little support to Assad. Russia occupied with the Ukraine war, and Iran with Hezbollah and Lebanon. The rebel factions met little resistance in their offensive. Now, Syria is emerging from under 2 generations of the Assad family rule, ending one of the most repressive and longest-running regimes in modern Middle Eastern history.
So will the Syrian people use this key moment to actually change what's been happening in Syria and distance themselves from the brutality that has been there from the Assad regime? Khazem, the main question being, what happens now? The Prime Minister of Syria said that the government is willing to work with any of the leadership that the people choose. But are we going to see that? And what type of a timeline are we talking about right now when we've already seen such a quick chain of events?
Well, here's to hoping, but let's talk facts here. Syria as a nation is destroyed economically, politically, socially, infrastructure-wise. This is a country that has been neglected by its own government, abused by its own government, and obviously outside forces, including Iran and Russia. There's a lot to be done. And we're talking about a group, hey, maybe their intentions are good or bad, but either way, they have no experience running a country. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a lot of need for external support for international community. However, silver lining here, what we've seen so far is encouraging. We're not seeing the mass looting we've seen in Iraq and Baghdad, if you remember when Baghdad fell in 2003. We are seeing some potentially positive aspects here. And we're hoping that positivity will continue and be built on so the international community can be a partner. And let me, add Israel here, because Israel is a neighboring country to Syria, and Israel has the capabilities, technology, and energy resources that can potentially help Syria build. And what does that mean? There's a better chance for peace today? I believe so. I believe we've never been closer to peace in the region than today. Peace with Syria is monumental. Of course, peace with the UAE, Bahrain, and potentially Saudi Arabia is very important. But Syria will change everything for Israel, and we're hoping there's a chance for peace here today.
That's a very positive message indeed. Qassem Al-Gabra, thank you for giving us your insight into this major development happening right now. Now, coming back in studio, Ariel Osran, what we just heard from Qassem, this is a key moment, it seems, that it could be for Israel. However this plays out. Now, the messaging that we're hearing from Israel right now is that they're going to watch the internal politics take place and they're not going to have any direct impact on that. But what should the role be that Israel's taking right now? I know they're monitoring the situation, but should more be done? Oh, they're doing a lot more than just monitoring the situation. They're seizing control of all strategic points in the buffer zone between Israel and Syria. In fact, Israeli forces have conquered basically the entire Mount Hermon, reaching areas that Israeli forces haven't been in 51 years. The furthest point that they've reached today is 14 kilometers from the Israeli border. That's farther than any point over the past 14 months of fighting in Gaza. Smaller than 14 kilometers, but either Gaza or Lebanon. And that's where the focus has been. This is truly dramatic. Now, why is Israel doing this? Because it fears that this chaotic situation that is potentially emerging in Syria could lead to a free-for-all, that anyone will try and cut up a slice of Syria, especially on the border with Israel, a strategic border that up until now the Syrians held a strategic advantage over Israel with the Mount Hermon. Speaking of that as well, the IDF spokesperson in Arabic now issuing an urgent message to Syrian residents in the south of Syria, urging them to evacuate immediately.
No, to remain in their homes because there's Israeli activity and they don't want anyone to be misidentified as potential threats to Israeli forces, so they're not calling for evacuation, but rather calling them to stay in their homes for their safety. And this coincides with, to my count, at least 3 waves of airstrikes in the capital Damascus and other areas in Syria, targeting regime military sites. Israel is taking advantage of this point in time, trying to eliminate the threat of Syrian military forces or military assets being taken over, used by elements that could seek to harm Israel, or God forbid, even the Iranian militias, that if they're still there, that they could take advantage of that. So Israel's on cleanup duty right now with everything regarding to the Syrian military. We have not yet heard any outrage from the Syrian rebels or even the Syrian population, because these are targeted strikes that are seeking to eliminate any potential threat that could emerge from these massive quantities of advanced weaponry, heavy machinery that was left behind by the Syrian regime, who all defected, the military, and they do not want to see them go into the wrong hands. So what Israel is doing now is a very proactive defensive step. Obviously, it entails also some striking and some conquering, but these all these areas in the buffer zone that were seized by Israeli forces without a single shot fired. And this is not clear whether this is indefinite or temporary, but at least in the immediate future, Israel does not want to see a new threat emerge on its northern border with Syria, as Syrians themselves try to make a future for themselves in these days to come.
And taking care of that old threat, that being many of the Iranian proxies that you mentioned as well. Until today, the Syrian government, it had been a key ally, because both strategically and geographically, for the Iranian-backed axis of resistance. But now Syria's future and its role in the fight against Israel and the United States is unclear. Our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini explains.
The Israelis call it the octopus. The Iranian-backed network of allied states and movements fighting against Israel and the U.S., including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and, until now, the government of Syria, also known as the Axis of Resistance. While Israel has been fighting a multi-front war, the battlefield just got even more complicated. Just a day after a ceasefire was reached between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed Syrian rebel factions began seizing government-held territory and reached the capital of Damascus in 10 days, ending a 50-year rule of the Assad family, one of Iran's key allies and a central player for the resistance.
This morning, we woke up to a new Syria. The regime has collapsed, and control in the country is changing hands. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. For the last 13 years, the country has been in turmoil.
Despite civil war and a volatile security situation, Syria has served as a vital bridge from Iran through Iraq and Lebanon, allowing the transfer of weapons and money to movements like Hezbollah. The geographic importance of Syria has made it central to the goals of the Axis of Resistance, with Iran helping ensure Bashar al-Assad remained in power until now.
I think what's happened in Syria, which of course happened the day after the ceasefire is when it started, is now creating a new weakness for Hezbollah, because it's going to make it very difficult for Iran, who's pulling out of Syria to some degree, be able to transfer weapons in.
On the one hand, this seismic moment in Syrian history deals a massive blow to the Axis of Resistance, which have now lost a key ally. On the other hand, the instability comes with a heightened risk of more radical Islamic terrorism, and that the fighting might spill over into Israel and the region.
We have to keep a close eye. We're very worried about chaos. We're very worried about extremism. We remain worried about the territorial integrity of Syria.
The IDF says it has sent more forces to the Golan Heights and the buffer zone with Syria.
So what does Iran have to say about Assad's fall? Well, to give us some more insight, I'm joined by Norman Rule, former senior U.S. intelligence official and senior advisor at United Against a Nuclear Iran, joining us from Washington, D.C. Norman, right now, Iran's reaction to losing this key ally, because it's not only Syria we're talking about. Over the course of the year, Iran has really lost 3 arenas in the Axis of Resistance: Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. So this is another major blow.
Good afternoon. Iran has watched the Axis of Resistance fracture, and a number of myths have been broken. For example, Iran constantly maintained that if Israel were to strike its proxies, Iran would defend them. Iran has not done so. Likewise, Iran said that if Israel were ever to strike Iran, the proxies would join together and overwhelm Israel. That didn't happen either. Many myths have been broken over the past year, largely due to Israel's courage and robust opportunities. But the game is not over for Iran, and much depends on how your timeline. Iran, in theory, continues to control about 100,000 proxies in Iraq, in Yemen. Hezbollah still exists. Hamas and remnants still exist. Iran will seek to rebuild, to restore, and therefore the timeline of how you look at this picture does impact your perspective.
And so how will Iran focus on that, or will they? Because as you talked about, so far they've been lacking in supporting these proxies because they haven't necessarily had the ability to do so. And so right now, even when we're talking about Hezbollah, let's say, in Lebanon, after they've even called back their forces from Syria back into Lebanon, before Iran had been supplying their weapons through Syria. Are we still going to see this be the case, or Iran's role in supporting these proxies, specifically Hezbollah, it's certainly become more complicated?
There are 3 fundamentals that you ought to keep in mind. First, the supreme leader has always insisted that Iranians will not die for proxies. Proxies may die for Iran, but Iran will fight to the last proxy. Second, Iran only succeeds in places where there is a militia or beleaguered authority that calls upon its support in the absence of another power. And last, Iran's support depends entirely on the scale, scope, and extent of its logistics capacity. Once that logistics line is cut, Iran's ability to support proxies is extremely limited. That's been consistent over the past couple of decades. So Iran must now find a way to restore logistics lines, travel lines between Beirut, Damascus, Sana'a, and Tehran itself. Iran can train people at IRGC camps in Iran itself. Iran can find ways to smuggle in weapons or teach proxies how to build their own weapons. But that logistics line is critical. And the absence or existence of a Western plan to address that logistics line will define Iran's future role in the region.
Well, Norman, Iran's foreign ministry said that only Syrian people will be able to determine the fate of their country without any destructive interference or foreign imposition. But who would Iran want to see taking over in power right now, and whichever force that may be, will Iran try to become allies with this new force in power in Syria?
Well, Iran's foreign ministry is not a reliable voice on any
Certainly
issue.
Not.
But Iran must maintain relations with the next Syrian government because of the religious shrines and in order to support the Shia community of Syria, with which Iran has had some engagement going back to the time of the Shah. So Iran will want some relationship with the Syrians. The question becomes, is Iran going to be pushed out, or how that relationship will be shaped by Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Emirates, other countries that may seek to influence the new Syrian government. And I believe that influence is almost certain to happen, but Iran will still try to edge its way in.
Trying days indeed. Norman Rule, thank you for giving us our insight into Iran's mindset right now. Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he visited the Syrian border today and claimed it was the IDF attacks on Hezbollah and Iran's axis of resistance that ultimately started this chain of events that caused Assad's regime to collapse. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say today.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its suppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel.
Well, as our Ariel Oseran explained, the IDF sent more troops to the buffer zone between Israel and Syria in the Golan Heights as a precaution in case any armed gunmen try to enter this buffer zone. And this is the first time IDF troops have taken up positions in the buffer zone since 1974. When the agreement on disengagement was signed at the end of the Yom Kippur War. Well, still, no changes to guidelines for residents in the Golan Heights at this time. And the IDF says it's not intervening on what's happening inside Syria. Let's get an update from the ground now, where our i24 News correspondent Emmanuel Onara is live in the Golan Heights. Emmanuel, how are the residents in the Golan Heights reacting to this major news out of Syria just across the border with them?
Right, Nicole, and it really is major news because it appears that the Syrian Druze of the Golan Heights, and particularly from the town of Majd al-Shams, one of the main towns of the Golan Heights, have actually showed their support for this new, the Syrian rebels in Syria. And historically, the Syrian Druze have actually been very pro-Assad. And in fact, on a personal note, I'd like to just go back about 10 or 11 years ago, at the very start of the Syrian civil war. I remember going to Majd al-Shams for a similar story, a similar report, just to find out what the take was of the Syrian Druze in the Golan Heights, in Majd al-Shams specifically, to see what their opinion was about what was going on just across the border. And these were in the early days of the Syrian civil war, when the people in the West, when Israel was a lot similar to the reactions that we saw today from around the world, especially from the West and Israel, were seeing Syria and Assad about to topple. And in fact, at the time, I remember going into these people's homes and seeing pictures of Assad all over the walls of the Syrian Druze in Majd al-Shams and being extremely surprised. Now, obviously, in the West back then, everyone was looking to see that Bashar al-Assad would actually topple, and here it is. Over 10 years later, since the start of the Syrian civil war, Assad has toppled, and it looks like all of that has also changed for the Syrian Druze, the community in the Golan Heights as well, Nicole.
Certainly interesting looking at the history there as well. Emmanuel Onora, thanks for that update live on the ground. Well, to keep this conversation going, I want to introduce another guest as well. Joining us now, Benjamin Anthony, CEO of the Miriam Institute, joining us from the United States. Benjamin, right now we're hearing from the Prime Minister himself, and he says Israel may have had an indirect hand in what's happening in Syria and what happened in Syria. But now the question is, how will this impact Israel? On the one hand, the Iranian regime is clearly weakened, lost their foothold in Syria. But on the other hand, radical Islamists could take over. We're talking about the remnants of al-Qaeda here. And so what could be the impact on Israel?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. Listen, Zionists, the rebels, certainly are not. But I think it behooves us to listen very carefully to what I view as an excellent statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu at the Israel-Syrian border that you just showed to your viewers, because he puts this into a very clear context. He described Assad as a vital link in the Iranian axis of evil. And he actually hearkened back in Ivrit, I don't know if he did so in English, but he hearkened back to invoking Operation Good Neighbor, which was when we saw the Israel Defense Forces establish a field hospital in the midst of the bloody Syrian civil war, where 500,000 Syrians were massacred by Assad, including by way of chemical weapons. We saw Israel establish this field hospital, treat these injured Syrians who came to the border, and then repatriate them secretively very often thereafter inside Syria as and when they wanted to, and Israel was able to. Now, there's a phrase in Judaism that says, that which you sow with tears, you will reap with joy. It's possible, just possible, that we can be slightly optimistic about the idea that some among these rebel forces were the beneficiaries of this benevolence of the state of Israel and may, just may, remember that. But in the absence of certainty on that point, what's going on with Israel's policy is very, very clear, and it can be simplified to a few key points. Number one, hold the territory that you capture in war. Imagine a situation where we did not hold the topographical advantage of the Golan Heights. In this reality, it would be a horrific nightmare for Israel and our security forces. Number two, keep your enemies off your borders. Keep them well away. That's why we are deploying into the demilitarized zone. And actually, it's not yet confirmed by the IDF, but apparently Israeli forces now hold the uppermost point on Mount Hermon, which gives them a full overlook over much of Syria, where all of this is taking place now.
Well, Benjamin, you mentioned pushing your enemies back from the border, and that's not only what we're seeing in Syria right now, but in Lebanon as well. This ceasefire that really did coincide with all the developments inside Syria. And so how will these latest developments impact the already shaky ceasefire that we've seen between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Yeah, thanks for your question, and you're really coming to something that I hope the powers that be in Israel will extrapolate from what's going on in Syria. Look, good old-fashioned principles of holding strategic depth, of holding the topographical advantage, of holding territory that you capture for the sake of security considerations, those old-fashioned principles need to be applied to the modern moment. They need to be applied certainly to the Palestinian area inside the Gaza Strip and Judea and Samaria, and as you just asked, certainly inside Lebanon, which is why I'm not a fan of the Lebanon ceasefire, the ceasefire between Israel and that country. I don't think that we've sufficiently guaranteed that we will keep Hezbollah away from our border. You bring back the Lebanese civilians to the border, you are bringing back the facilitators, at least, of Hezbollah. And I think that we can remember from October the 8th, when Hezbollah, of its own volition, joined the fray in 2023, Israelis were talking about the importance of the enforcement of Resolution 1701 and a demilitarized/buffer zone. Neither of those things have been brought about, and in their absence, it's going to be a very tenuous, very shaky ceasefire As I said, I'm not a fan of it. I'm very, very appreciative of the tremendous gains the IDF made in southern Lebanon. Those are beyond reproach. But you cannot bring these people back to the border with Israel. Territory matters. It's important. Anybody who doubts that, I suggest that they open a map and take a very, very good look at the harsh reality of the terrain in the Middle East.
Benjamin, stay with us, but I want to bring into the conversation our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran as well. Benjamin's talking about making sure that our enemies are away from the border, and that is in line with the activity that we spoke about earlier in this broadcast as well. But I want to dig into something else that you mentioned, the fact that the IDF striking these military assets and weapons assets that could be used against Israel, and if they get into the wrong hands. And so right now, when we're talking about Hezbollah then rearming itself, this had been a key gateway between Syria and Lebanon. Hezbollah has recalled their forces back into Lebanon, leaving that open from Syria. And so right now in this ceasefire period, will Hezbollah be able to rearm themselves without this critical area between the Syria and Lebanese border?
I think the developments that we're seeing unfold before our eyes right now are the completing element for the ceasefire that make it sustainable for Israel. Was the concern in Israel that Benjamin is voicing, legitimate concerns that it's not hermetic in preventing Hezbollah from rearming itself, from regrouping, because at the end of the day, we know that Syria wasn't only the weapon storage facility of Hezbollah, but it was also the main route of weapon smuggling into Lebanon. But now the border between Lebanon and Syria on the Syrian side is controlled by rebels, and on the Lebanese side is controlled by the Lebanese army. And so that ground route connecting Iran via Iraq, Syria to Lebanon, that has been severed. And so as far as Israel is concerned, that is what it wants to see. The question will be, moving forward, the solutions, the resolution that the Syrians themselves come up with, their own governance, who will be in control at the end of the day. I think we shouldn't be too concerned that the leadership will once again reestablish ties with the Iranians, because right now, as we speak, the leader of Hayat Tahrir Hashem, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he is giving a speech in the historic Umayyad mosque in Damascus, saying that the Iranian influence is gone, no more. He's been targeting them more than any other enemy of the Syrian people as the true cause for all the suffering in Syria, even more than the Russians. And it's both Iran and Russia helped Assad complete his takeover over much of the country back in the height of the civil war, 2015. 2016, and so it is not it's not inconceivable that this ground link between Iran and Lebanon will remain severed under whatever new regime we do see in Syria, and that is the completing element that Israel wanted, and you could also say needed to see, in order to look forward and see this as a sustainable solution in preventing Hezbollah from rearming. It is not the only way for them to rearm, but it was the most effective way for them to rearm. And so once you take that out of the picture, that moving forward, that is very beneficial for Israel's safety.
And so the big question here, and Benjamin, I want to come back to you for this, is how Israel should move forward with these latest developments. Because if there is an opportunity here, and I don't want to be too optimistic, let's say, or unrealistic, but is there any way that Israel could seize this opportunity to actually make some sort of a relationship with whoever the new Syrian government might turn out to be?
Well, first of all, there already is something of a relationship. There has already been clear coordination between the Israel Defense Forces and the various Syrian rebel forces that are running around there in that country, expressing from our point of view that they are not to come too close to our border. Now, they actually did seek to move close to an UNDOF outpost, very close to Majd al-Shams on the Syrian side of the border, and the IDF more or less had to chase them away, had to intervene at some level. So there is that degree of communication. I just want to say, though, that to build on what Ariel said in his analysis, brilliant as always, is we are seeing the severing of this chain. That's important and it's positive. But what is really required is the uprooting of this chain from its foundation. And that means, in my view, doing that which everybody understands is required, namely hitting Iran. And I believe that we are able to hit Iran's nuclear weapons program. I think that they are exposed to a historic degree. They are absent their proxies. We have shown and damaged their air defense capabilities. And if we don't do that, we will not bring about an end to this immiserating circumstance where they're constantly resupplying their proxies right on our borders. The other thing I will say, just for people to keep in mind, is the Iranian regime, as we've seen in Syria, is a regime that we would like to see fall. Now, it's much more complex. It's nowhere near as simple to bring about as we saw in Syria, primarily because about 70% of the Syrian forces are actually Sunni forces, and the high command were Alawites, but the soldiers were Sunni and therefore broadly allowed to leave the battlefield by the rebels. But one thing I will say, the Iranian regime is more fragile today than yesterday, and the idea of it being toppled is more realistic today than yesterday. Does that mean it's a fait accompli? Far from it. But I think that it is woefully exposed. We should exploit that and press hard upon that weakness.
There could be critical moves ahead for Israel, it certainly seems. Benjamin Anthony, thank you so much for your analysis and joining us. I also want to thank Ariel Osran for joining us in studio, as well as we start moving on and talk about these external players that have also been a part of what we've been seeing now in Syria. Because after ousting Assad, the Syrian rebels, they now have their eye on the Kurdish forces in the north of the country, the Islamist rebels who are backed by Turkey. And they launched an attack on Kurds in the northern town of Manbij. In an interview to the news channel, Kurdistan 24, the former head of the Syrian National Council said within this new Syria, all people, including the Kurds, should be protected. But the question is, will that be the case? Well, for more, I'm joined by the executive director of the Kurdish Peace Institute, Giran Özkan. Giran, thanks for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Now, historically, the HTS, which is the rebel organization that really led this offensive, and the Kurds, they have not gotten along. So what could HTS, this takeover by them, mean for the Kurdish population right now?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say that the HTS has really not gotten along with civilization and humanity itself. As you know, HTS, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. It was Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria for the longest time. And we remember the videos of HTS fighters beheading people across Syria and Kurds too. So the HTS, no one should deceive themselves about what the HTS is, what it stands for. And so the Kurds in the past and currently in certain places have had conflict with the HTS. There are two conflicting worldviews there. The Kurds in their regions have built a pluralist, viable, democratic governance that is sensitive to international norms and standards, whereas the HTS, as we saw in Idlib and in the places it has controlled, has largely forced upon the people their own way of life, which is rather contrary to civilization as we know it. So there's definitely a divide there in worldviews and a divide there militarily. So it's going to be a decision for the people of Syria, but also the neighbors of Syria as to what kind of country they want to see going forward.
Well, let's talk about that neighbor of Syria, Turkey. How does Turkey tie into this? Because the Turkey, they're backing the rebels, and Turkey wants to see a buffer zone, so to speak, between its border, pushing the Kurds away. And so will they have more influence over HTS because of their own personal interests?
Absolutely. So the Kurds, Turkey is trying very hard to export its domestic Kurdish policies, which have all to do with pushing back against any kind of Kurdish political articulation, and they are willing to go to any length to do this. As you know, before, Turkey allowed for ISIS fighters to infiltrate Syria by the thousands through its borders, purely to push back and fight against the Kurds. And they are continuing that policy now with ISIS and Al-Qaeda's remnants, which are the HTS and the SNA, which is the Syrian groups that are backed by Turkey, which have committed atrocities all across, specifically the Kurdish region. So Turkey's main priority right now is not to democratize Syria. It's to do anything and everything to make sure that the Kurds don't have a seat at the table and that the Kurds aren't a part of a future Syria, just like they are trying very hard to do within their own borders. And no one should be mistaken. Turkey is willing to see an Islamist government, an Islamist government back in Damascus to ensure that the Kurds aren't a part of a future Syria.
Well, Giran, quickly here, how could the United States possibly change this with their support for the Kurds and possibly against Turkey then?
Well, right now, the United States, through its partnership with the Kurds, has significant sway in how Syria ultimately shapes up to be. And it would be, I think, a terrible mistake for the US to relinquish that influence. And I don't think that will be the case. We've already had National Security Advisor, current National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say that they are committed to that partnership with the Kurds and the SDF to fight back against ISIS, which is the US mission right now. And ISIS is really seeking this opportunity to re-emerge in the pockets of Syria that it's in right now, but also going forward. Right now, the Kurds and the US are jointly controlling areas almost across the border between Syria and Iraq to ensure that Iran's influence in the region does not re-establish itself. We saw in the past few days, the SDF took the city of Deir ez-Zor, where a whole load of Iranian militias were basing themselves, who had to leave through the Al-Kamal border crossing with Iraq. And to ensure that Iran does not gain a foothold in the future Syria, the US and their partnership with the Kurds are going to be significant in the future. And that's why I believe that the US will not relinquish the influence that it has gained for its partnership with the Kurds in shaping a future Syria.
It should certainly be interesting to see exactly how this impacts the Kurdish population, mainly in the north. Giran Özkan, thank you so much for that update.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we talked about Turkey's role in Assad's collapse, but what about Russia's role, or lack of a role, really? Because in 2011, during the start of Syria's civil war, Russia had a huge hand in stopping the rebel offensive and helping Assad stay in power. But this time around, Russia was occupied with its own war in Ukraine. I'd like to welcome now Professor Ariel Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, joining us from Washington, D.C. Ariel, I know it might seem obvious for some, but the question is, why was Russia reluctant to bail the regime out this time around? Is it because they're occupied with their own war in Ukraine?
Three things. One, Russia is occupied in Ukraine. Two, everybody was surprised. Nobody had enough time to assess intelligence and realize how quickly the Assad regime will fall. And three, while the relationship between Russia and Turkey were deteriorating, and I see reports that Putin is mad at Erdogan, Putin didn't realize how deliberately Erdogan is willing to punch against his and Iranians' client, Bashar al-Assad. And I would also add, it was self-inflicted because the tip of the spear in Syria for the Russian power projection was a Wagner group. Remember Wagner rebellion? It sounds like ancient history, but it was in summer of 23 that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, rebelled against Putin. So once Wagner was put down, there was nobody there in Syria to fight on behalf of Russia.
Well, Ariel, so now what does this mean for Russia's ties to the Middle East? Could they be losing some of these ties to the region? And then perhaps what will they do to try and maintain some resemblance of power in the Middle East?
It's challenging because I see reports now the giant Russian transportation airplanes that brought equipment to the Khmeimim air base in Syria are back there again, probably taking the equipment out, taking the Russian troops out. So it looks like, and I don't have independent confirmation, it looks like Russia may be evacuating the Khmeimim air base. There was also a report that the Russian ships left the Tartus base. So it could be that Russia is folding. The main thing is whether the rebels in Syria, HTS, etc., are going to roll over the Alawi enclave and take over it. Because if Alawi enclave doesn't survive, there's no way Russia can keep these bases. But more importantly are two other things. Both Russia and Iran build their strategy of pushing out the pro-Western, pro-US forces out of the Middle East on Syria. Syria was key to resupply Hezbollah. Syria was key for Russian power projection, not just in the Mediterranean. They don't have any other military bases in the Mediterranean basis, but also to project power further into the Middle East and into Africa. Now it's finished. And then the question is, will Russia and Iran continue their cooperation? There are a lot of reports that we see that Iran may accelerate its nuclear program. Will Russia stand by Iran? Would Russia, for example, give Iran warhead technology? Because nuclear warhead technology is complicated. Iran probably doesn't have it. It's not clear if North Korea has it or not. So if the United States and or Israel decide to develop the success now and take out the Iranian nuclear weapons, to what extent Russia is willing to stand by Iran, and with what means, as Russia is bogged down
How
in
these
Ukraine.
two allies might stay together certainly should be interesting in the coming weeks. Ariel Cohen, thank you so much for your insight and for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump, he had some strong words to say about Russia abandoning Syrian President Assad, saying Moscow never should have protected him in the first place. Now, Trump says whatever is happening in Syria should be an internal problem. The United States should not have anything to do with it. Writing on social media, quote, "This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved." Well, to talk about how the United States does play into all of this, we're joined now by retired Colonel Rich Outzen, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a geopolitical consultant at Dragoman LLC. Right now, Rich, the United States does have some 900 troops in Syria. These are including U.S. forces that work alongside Kurdish allies in the opposition-held northeast to really prevent this resurgence of the Islamic State. And so what will their group, these U.S. troops on the ground, what will their role be?
Well, it's good to be with you. First of all, the President-elect Trump has made clear with these posts, not the only one that you've shown there, but previous posts as well, and in public comments, that he does not see a role moving forward for the United States to maintain troops in northeast Syria. He was president when the territorial caliphate of the Islamic State in Syria was dismantled, and he was not the one who started the policy of partnering with the YPG, the Syrian affiliate of the PKK terror group, as they are recognized by the United States. The PKK is, that is. And frankly, that policy still persists today because the Biden administration never adapted its policy. The policy circa 2014 was ISIS is a bigger problem than the Syrian revolution and Assad. Now, we've seen since October 7th, 2023, both for Israel and for the United States, for our interest in the area, Assad was far worse than whatever the opposition represents. So this kicking the can down the road that started in 2014, 2015, saying ISIS and only ISIS matters, has actually kind of failed now. The expiration date on that policy has been reached. I think Trump is right. We should not have intervened in the revolution, Syrian revolution, as it unfolded in its final stages. Now Assad is gone. It's a big question that's going to have to be negotiated between the new government in Damascus, which will be opposition-led, and Turkey, who's the big backer of the opposition, and the United States for when and how those troops can be removed while still maintaining control of ISIS prisoners and other threats in the Northeast.
Rich, we're talking about the president-elect, Donald Trump, but he's not in office quite yet. We still have Joe Biden, and he's going to be meeting with his national security team later today to talk about these developments inside Syria. And so in the immediate future, what might be the United States' hand and role?
Well, so the first overriding priority will be the safety and security of U.S. forces and facilities in Northeast Syria. Because obviously it's a dynamic situation. The fall of Damascus is not the last act in this play, so to speak. If you've been following events on the ground, you'll know that the Turkish-supported opposition also appears to have taken control of Manbij in eastern Aleppo province from the SDF YPG, the group that the United States supports. There's also areas along the Euphrates River near Raqqa and elsewhere in Deir ez-Zor where the locals are essentially making it very clear they don't want the U.S.-supported force, the YPG-PYD, to control that area. They're majority Arab areas, and they want to be part of the new Syria that's being formed. So I think if I were to advise President Biden, I would say think about how to consolidate the U.S. presence there and maintain relations with the SDF in order to keep our troops secure, but make clear to the new government in Damascus that's going to be forming and to the Turks that we will take any actions necessary to protect our borders.
We will have to see exactly how the United States does play out in this. We do have to go out now. Rich Alton, thank you for joining us, and thanks for watching this special edition.
Introducing the brand new i24NEWS Video on Demand app.
You'll have instant access to all our programs, reports, in-depth discussions, and expert commentary.
Whenever you want it.
So what are you waiting for? Download the i24NEWS Video on Demand app today.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish World Weekly. I'm Khaled Ben David, and each week we're going to bring you